David Wallace is a recurring character from The Office that is widely viewed by the fandom in a positive light. Most fans of The Office see David Wallace as a straight everyman that grounds the otherwise larger-than-life characters like Michael in the reality of corporate America. His overall demeanor and heck, even the way that he looks, screams executive. He's someone who is very friendly with Jim, one of the key heartbeats of the show, and is idolized by Michael. It is only natural, then, that we as the audience begin to see David Wallace in the same way. I've watched through The Office from start to finish multiple times at this point, thank you, COVID, but it was only on my last viewing that I really started to think about David Wallace's actions in the show. Is the appreciation and general positive feelings that I have toward him justified? Do the actions that David Wallace takes warrant the general warm feelings that the fandom has for him? Naturally, the documentary crew's focus on the Scranton branch means that we only have a limited view into what David Wallace does on a day-to-day basis. As the CFO of Dunder Mifflin, a publicly traded company, David Wallace has many responsibilities that we simply do not see. I won't speculate on these, except for what I can infer based on what appears in the show. The first time we are introduced to David Wallace is when he reviews the performance of all of the branches of Dunder Mifflin. As far as first impressions go, I think these interactions go a long way to building our positive impression of David Wallace. He shows a respectable amount of restraint in his reaction to Michael's bizarre video when asked about the performance of his branch. Michael eventually shows that he was, in fact, prepared to present the figures from his branch, but I think David would have been justified to being less polite than he was in this initial interaction. He also is lenient when Michael's comment about sleeping with Jan comes to light. This moment is used to highlight Michael's character, in showing that he can sincerely own up to his actions and defend Jan admirably. David takes, in the audience eyes, a very merciful and positive action of accepting Michael's apology and asking that nothing like this can happen again. He doesn't rock the boat, he doesn't fire Michael or Jan, something that a non-comedy series David Wallace could justifiably do. The next we spend time with David Wallace is at the party he and his wife throw at his house. He once again shows an extreme level of patience and restraint as Michael repeatedly puts his foot in his mouth and makes Jan, and us, continuously uncomfortable. We also see his first interactions with Jim. David singles Jim out and asks him to play basketball with him rather than schmooze with everyone at the party. Who knows whether David was aware that Jim liked basketball, but he could have picked no better way to butter up a key employee from the Scranton office. This leads Jim to instantly have a good rapport with David, which leads us, the viewers, to start liking him even more because of how relatable he seems. David uses this conversation to ask about what's going on with Michael and Jan. An understandable question given the recent circumstances, but it's an undoubtedly gossip-adjacent question to ask an employee significantly his junior on his first occasion of meeting him. From this point on, David begins to appear more in the documentary footage, starting mostly with phone calls to Michael. After the merger of the Scranton and Stanford branches, Michael gets more responsibility and thus more exposure to David Wallace as the CFO. However, the next key actions that David takes are during Jan's firing. This sequence is again something that is not generally viewed in a negative light. We as the audience are fully aware of how badly Jan is spiraling, and not at all surprised to hear David's laundry list of Jan's misdeeds and professional malfeasances. But looking back on David's actions during this time objectively show that they are at the very least questionable, if not outright objectionable. First, he begins to publicly interview candidates for Jan's job before even informing her that she was going to be let go. I sympathize with David here, of course. It is natural to want to fill a job position before there's a vacancy. But he knew that one of the key candidates for the role, whether he was truly serious about offering it to Michael or not, was in a personal relationship with Jan. Even giving an interview in that situation without Michael being informed that it was for Jan's job is ethically questionable. Jan's surprise also stands out. She seems blindsided by the decision, enough to claim that the firing is motivated by her decision to get breast enhancement surgery. If her behavior was as erratic as they say, shouldn't she have been approached by David, or at the very least HR, to discuss that her performance was lacking? David's moment where he clears his chest to Jan comes across like it's the first time he's saying anything to her. Another seriously questionable managerial decision. David also shows clear favoritism in the hiring process for Jan's position, in that he clearly meant for Jim to get it. Obviously, it is normal in the business world for connections to mean a lot when it comes to advancing up the corporate ladder. Also, we don't know all of the facts of how Jim is as an employee. We know Jim as a prank-loving slacker, but clearly he has ability at his job. He shows throughout the series that he has selling ability and an eye towards business strategy when he actually puts his mind to his work. David makes it painfully obvious that he is hand-selecting Jim for this position, regardless of his performance at the interview. It can easily be missed since the focus of the documentary crew is on Jim realizing his feelings for Pam, but David is talking to Jim as if he already has the job. He refers to how Jim will love it in New York and that the only person he won't like is their HR rep. To David, this interview is only a formality. Jim has the job if he wants it. But is Jim the best candidate for the position? Even taking Michael out of consideration, one can assume that there are other branch managers who are being interviewed for the role. Jim, to this point, has no managerial experience other than being the number 2 of the Scranton office. However, Jim is still a better choice than who ultimately gets the job. David's choice of Ryan for Jam's position at corporate is an insane decision. He could not have known that Ryan would eventually defraud the company, but elevating an employee who is barely more than a temp to a senior management position is genuinely crazy. I know that there were real-world reasons for this choice. BJ Novak was a writer for the show and needed more time to focus on his writing. Putting Ryan in that position would lead to hijinks that the writers could exploit, including complicating his relationship with Michael. But if you take the decision at face value, it forces you to question David's decision-making. Ryan had to be the most junior candidate who was interviewed, with the least experience both with the company and professionally. He has no management experience and, as Michael on multiple occasions points out, has never actually made a sale. If Michael wasn't obsessed with him, he likely would not be employed at Dunder Mifflin. There's no doubt that some of Ryan's decisions could have worked, but that is exactly the danger of trusting Ryan. He is a con artist, a snake oil salesman. He takes the kernel of a good idea, in this case, attempting to invest in the website and help improve customer service, and botches the execution because he doesn't have the skill or care to follow through on his ideas, and David fell for it. The next key decision that David makes is during Michael's job aid fundraiser after the office gets robbed. David finds out that Michael is dating Holly, the new HR rep at the office, and immediately transfers her back to the Nashua branch. Of course, you have to consider the history here. Michael's relationship with Jan was clearly destructive, personally and professionally. There is an element where I can understand David's desire to avoid having something similar happen. Also, there is no denying the conflict of interest when the HR representative and the branch manager have a romantic relationship. However, David immediately moves to transfer Holly with no investigation or time for deliberation on whether it was the right move. He deliberately breaks up the relationship sight unseen, no questions asked. Perhaps a wise move professionally, but certainly not the kindest. And it is certainly not the last time he would antagonize Michael. Much later, David Wallace brings in Charles Miner, an outside hire, to fill in the new role overseeing Michael. On its own, not the wrong decision, but he also pairs this with cutting himself off from Michael completely. He even forwards all of Michael's calls directly to Charles. Charles Miner's no-nonsense style of management was always going to run into trouble when dealing with Michael. Michael is a tough man to manage at the best of times, and taking a hard line and imposing your will is the recipe for a strained relationship. However, I do believe there is a world in which this could have worked. Michael did work with pre-relationship Jan after all. I believe David set Charles up to fail here. First, David did not address the heart of Michael's problem. Yes, Michael wants to always get his way, but really he wanted to feel like he was heard. David shut him out completely. Rather than keep communication with Michael going and help him work through his relationship with Charles, he threw them at each other and ignored the situation when it was clearly deteriorating. Michael then goes on to start his own paper company, leading to disastrous results for the company and forces David to offer Michael a buyout, something that the straining budget of Dunder Mifflin can ill afford. As Phyllis says,
"You just returned Michael's call, none of us would have lost clients."
At this point, his relationship with Michael is repaired. But David takes this mistake and compounds it by overcorrecting too far in the other direction. During the episode Company Picnic, Michael and Holly reveal that the company is planning to close the Buffalo branch. David then chews Michael out, saying that he told him this information in confidence. Michael is clearly in the wrong here, but how could David reveal such a sensitive piece of news to Michael of all people? He has proven himself time and time and time again to not be able to keep a secret. But it may be that very trust of Michael that leads us to like David so much. He is willing to stick his neck out for someone who consistently proves to be untrustworthy. He is more than fair and even highlights Michael to the broader company. In shareholder meeting, Michael is brought to New York to be presented to Dunder Mifflin's shareholders as a bright spot of the company. We don't learn this from the documentary crew, but it is implied that David Wallace blessed Michael being there since he could easily have vetoed his appearance. It is also David Wallace that explicitly tells Michael on stage next to hot mics that the company could be going out of business. A reckless thing to do at best. When Michael takes over the shareholder meeting and it turns into a disaster, leadership may blame Michael, but they really should blame David for allowing it to happen. Later in the series, it is also David Wallace's decision to promote Jim and Michael to co-managers of the Scranton branch. I never understood why he could not return to his initial plan of promoting Michael to a more senior position while promoting Jim to branch manager. Instead, he takes the novel approach of having co-managers. Most of the office is skeptical of the decision from the start, and it leads to far more problems than it solves. I believe a key reason why Jim ultimately fails at being a manager is because David Wallace undermines him from the start. The office never really saw Jim as the boss, with Michael around, and it led Jim to make dumb and risky decisions to show that he has authority. If David had just gone forward with the initial plan to promote Jim as sole branch manager, I believe he could have performed just as competently as Karen and Utica. But not all of David's business decisions are necessarily bad on their face. He personally travels to Scranton to praise the golden ticket idea, and he attempts to reward who he thinks came up with it with exposure to the broader company. He successfully captures the territory, which was owned by Prince family paper, and even brings Michael to New York to learn about his managerial strategies. We can't know everything that David Wallace did during this time, but it is undeniable that while serving as the CFO, Dunder Mifflin nearly became insolvent. During the episode Murder, he reveals to Jim that by the end of the year, the company will run out of money. He may not have been the cause of those troubles, but there seem to be more instances of him harming rather than helping the company with the decisions that he makes. It is at this point in the show that Sabre buys Dunder Mifflin and David Wallace and other executives are fired from the company. However, it is not the last we see of David Wallace and not even the last of his questionable decisions. After Andy convinces David to buy Dunder Mifflin back from Sabre, he is introduced to Robert California, or whatever his true name is. After just one conversation with Robert, David decides to give him $1 million to go abroad and teach young gymnasts. It's a ridiculous idea, but it's a far more ridiculous thing for David to do in this situation. Somehow, within the span of one conversation, David is duped into handing over $1 million to someone he only just met. David is a wealthy man, but even for him, that is not an insignificant amount of money. David isn't presented as a gullible man, but he acts like one. He never even realizes that Andy abandons the Scranton office to live on a boat for months. We never learn what David's new role is at the company, nor do we have any insights into the corporate structure of Dunder Mifflin in the post-Sabre world, but it seems clear that there is no one in the Jan Ryan role overseeing the Scranton office. Instead, it seems that David deals directly with Andy as the branch manager, so it makes it all the more incredible that David could be unaware of Andy's absence for such a long time. Even if he was emailed regularly, wouldn't it be natural to physically visit the office at least once in a 3-month span? If not David himself, it's unthinkable that he wouldn't even send a proxy to meet with Andy in person. Again, David shows a level of negligence that someone with his experience in business and with the people of this office should ever show. When David ultimately discovers what happened, his first reaction is not to fire Andy, but to keep him on as the branch manager. The office literally proved for months that it did not need Andy to function, and Andy picked up at least 3 months worth of salary while doing no work. But David saw fit to keep him in the role for helping him to buy Dunder Mifflin? Honestly, it's a baffling decision. The final decisions that David makes in the show is to fire Andy and to hire Dwight. Honestly, both the correct decisions in terms of the show and reality. Looking back on David Wallace's actions in totality, I can see exactly the reasons why David Wallace is viewed favorably by fans. He puts up with Michael's hijinks, yes, but he also puts trust and faith in Michael when he really shouldn't. But taking an objective view of his actions puts things in a different light. When given the opportunity, he takes a "it's just good business" approach. He doesn't hesitate to make a business decision without considering the impact to others. He'll interview for jobs that aren't open and leverage those interviews to fish for information about problem employees. And honestly, he's really not a good manager at all. Nearly all of his decisions in the show range from neutral to downright awful. He consistently sets up his subordinates for failure and takes no action to correct his mistakes until it's too late. He frequently makes baffling decisions when presented with normal business problems. He also shows a tendency to be gullible at best or negligent at worst. There's a lot to love about David Wallace, but there's also a lot to not love about him too.